The paper felt heavier than it should have, the edges cool against my fingers while afternoon light slanted through the window and dust floated like it always had. Everything looked ordinary. My purse on the chair, the low hum of the air conditioner, the faint smell of lemon cleaner, and yet my chest tightened as I realized something had already shifted. By the time the pen left the page, a quiet door inside my life had closed. If you're watching this and you've ever trusted the wrong person, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than anyone wants to admit. I remember standing there, telling myself I was safe, telling myself this was care, not control. The calm was convincing, the smiles were practiced, and beneath it all, something essential was being taken without a sound. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I signed my name over breakfast, sunlight warming the table, thinking I was agreeing to a simple check-in, a harmless form my son said would make travel easier. By early afternoon, my phone was gone, my purse locked away, and a heavy door closed behind me with a sound that didn't belong in a place meant for rest. In the space of a few quiet hours, my freedom disappeared. I remember the exact second confusion turned into something colder. The calm voices, the reassuring smiles, the way everyone seemed prepared for my panic except me. That was when it hit me that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned. My own child had handed me the pen and watched me sign myself out of my life. I was 62, newly widowed, still learning how to breathe in a house that echoed with absence. I had trusted the one person who promised to protect me. Instead, I was being managed, contained, erased with paperwork and polite explanations, standing there, stripped of choice. I understood something terrifying and clarifying at once. This had been intentional, and if it could happen so smoothly, it hadn't started that morning. That truth still chills me. I need to take you back to who I was before everything tilted. After my husband died, the house grew quiet in a way that felt physical. Mornings stretched longer. I kept routines because they steadied me. Coffee, a short walk, bills paid on time. I wasn't helpless. I was grieving, learning how to carry loss without letting it define every hour. I had been independent my whole life. I raised a family, managed money, made decisions. Still, grief softens your edges. It makes reasonable help feel like relief instead of surrender. When my son began calling more, stopping by, checking that I ate and slept, it felt like love doing what love does. I wanted to believe that care could arrive without strings. He noticed the empty evenings, the way I hesitated about plans. He suggested small changes, gentle ones, framed as rest. I told myself it was healthy to lean on family, that accepting support didn't erase my strength. Trust felt earned, built on decades of shared history and ordinary affection. Looking back, there were no alarms, only kindness, consistency, and my own desire to feel less alone. I wasn't reckless, I was human, standing in a season where certainty was thin and comfort mattered. When the idea of a short trip came up, a change of scenery sounded healing. I believed a few days away might help me breathe again, and I said yes. At the time, it felt like the right step forward for me then. I told myself it was just a trip, a few days somewhere calm, away from the silence of my house. The drive felt longer than expected, roads narrowing, cell service thinning, until we reached a place that looked like a brochure brought to life. Neat gardens, clean buildings, everything carefully arranged to feel safe. At first glance, it was beautiful. Too beautiful. Maybe. Staff appeared quickly, already knowing my name, guiding me with practiced warmth. My bag was taken before I thought to hold on to it. Doors closed softly but firmly behind us. I noticed how often they used words like rest and support, how rarely they used time frames. I felt small moments of unease. The schedule posted in the lobby was vague. Common areas were plentiful, but exits were not obvious. When I wandered a little too far down a hallway, someone gently redirected me, smiling, explaining it was for my comfort. I nodded, embarrassed by my suspicion. My son stayed close, reassuring in his presence. I told myself he wouldn't put me somewhere unsafe. I reminded myself that grief can make a person paranoid, that exhaustion can turn care into threat. Each doubt was quietly corrected by logic, by love, by my desire not to cause trouble. By evening, paperwork appeared, framed as routine. I skimmed, trusting the tone more than the words. When I signed, it felt temporary, like agreeing to a hotel policy. Still, a strange weight settled in my chest. Something had shifted, and I had just agreed to stay. I remember noticing the quiet then, the kind that presses in, and wondering when I would be leaving, even as everyone acted as if the answer had already been decided for me. I ignored that thought and followed the plan laid in front of me. I woke early, disoriented, and decided to step outside for air. The hallway was quiet, lights dimmed, carpet muffling my steps. When I reached the exit door, I pulled the handle without thinking. It didn't move. I tried again, slower, listening for the click that never came. Someone appeared beside me, calm, pleasant, already prepared. I felt guided back rather than blocked. The explanation delivered softly, as if volume could change meaning. I was told it wasn't time, that my schedule mattered, that rest required structure. The words sounded reasonable until I realized the choice wasn't mine. Heat rose in my chest. I thought of errands left undone, of calling a friend, of simply walking. Each ordinary impulse stopped at the same invisible wall. I understood then that I wasn't a guest waiting for checkout. I was a patient following rules I hadn't agreed to understand. The sharpest pain wasn't fear, it was clarity. My child knew this door would not open. He knew the smiles were policy, the kindness conditional. Trust collapsed into something brittle, and I stood there holding the pieces, shocked by how quietly it happened. Freedom doesn't always disappear with force. Sometimes it leaves politely, with paperwork and schedules, with assurances meant to soothe. As I was led away, I noticed other women moving slowly through the halls, eyes lowered, each of us carrying the same dawning realization. And I began to see that I was not alone in that moment of shared, silent understanding together. Once I started paying attention, I saw the other women everywhere, sitting quietly in corners, walking loops of the same hallway, holding themselves as if trying not to take up space. They were different ages and backgrounds, but grief and confusion softened their faces in the same way it had softened mine. I noticed how few visitors came, how names were spoken less often over time, how belongings slowly disappeared from rooms. Some women arrived hopeful and well-dressed, still explaining their lives to anyone who would listen, certain this was temporary. Weeks later, their posture changed, voices lowered, expectations shrinking to meal times and scheduled activities. I began to understand the timelines without being told, the pattern of drop-offs followed by silence. Many had adult children who handled paperwork, finances, decisions, all framed as help during a vulnerable moment. The longer I watched, the clearer it became that this place was not about healing, but control, inheritance, convenience, Discomfort with aging parents hovered beneath the surface like an unspoken agreement. My fear shifted into something heavier as I realized how easy it was for families to erase us. These women weren't failures or burdens. They were inconvenient. I stopped seeing myself as unlucky and started seeing the system clearly. If I stayed passive, I would fade the same way I saw others fading. That realization hardened me, replacing shock with focus. They thought I was just another quiet widow, and that mistake would matter. I began paying attention to schedules, faces, routines, anything that could be used later. Fear was still there, but now it had direction. I was done waiting to be rescued and started preparing to protect myself. In that quiet place, resolve became my first real freedom. It was small, but it was mine again. They thought I was weak because grief makes people uncomfortable. When you move slower, speak less, hesitate before answering. Others decide for you. After my husband died, exhaustion lived in my bones. I cried easily. I forgot small things. That was enough for them to label me fragile. Age helped the story along. Gray hair, careful steps, a quiet voice. None of it meant I couldn't think. It meant I was tired. But tired gets mistaken for confused, and confused gets managed. My son saw compliance where there was trust. The staff saw silence where there was restraint. Everyone filled in the gaps with what suited them. At first, I resisted in small ways. Questions, discomfort, a tightening in my chest that wanted to speak. It went nowhere. Every concern was smoothed over, every protest reframed as anxiety. I realized pushing back only confirmed the version of me they preferred. So I stopped. I nodded. I rested when told. I let my thoughts wander inward instead of outward. Confusion became something I wore lightly, like a coat I could remove when needed. They relaxed when I did that. Doors stayed closed, but eyes turned away. Underneath, I was awake. I listened. I noticed patterns, routines, moods. I learned when people rushed and when they lingered. They mistook stillness for surrender. That was their error. Weakness was the mask they gave me. I decided to keep it and wait, quietly. I prepared for whatever chance patience would eventually place within reach. I noticed her before she noticed me. She moved differently from the others, not rushed, not distant, just attentive in a quiet way. When she passed by, her eyes lingered a second longer than necessary, as if checking whether I was really there. It wasn't kindness in the obvious sense. It was small things. An extra pause before closing a door, a cup placed within reach instead of out of it. Nothing that could be reported, nothing that drew attention, but enough to register as intention. Over time, I realized she was watching the same details I was. Who asked questions? Who never did? Which rules were enforced and which were flexible if no one was looking? We never spoke about it, but the awareness settled between us like a shared breath. I understood the risk she was taking. Even noticing me was a choice. Even seeing me as capable was a quiet defiance. That knowledge steadied me more than comfort ever could. For the first time since arriving, I felt less alone. Not safe, but less invisible. And I began to understand that surviving this place would depend on patience, attention, and knowing how the machinery around us moved. Once I stopped pushing against the walls, I started studying them. Resistance brought attention. Attention brought consequences. So I became careful. I listened more than I spoke. I watched more than I reacted. Days here followed patterns disguised as care. Meals arrived at the same times. Medication rounds created predictable gaps. Shift changes softened rules for a few minutes, then hardened them again. Some staff enforced everything rigidly. Others relied on routine and didn't look too closely as long as no one disrupted the flow. I learned who carried authority and who only carried instructions. I learned which doors were always locked and which were simply assumed to be. I learned that compliance made people invisible, and invisibility bought time. So I complied. I showed up. I rested when told. I asked harmless questions that revealed more in the answers than in the words themselves. Inside, I stayed alert. Patience became my discipline. Every day, I built a quiet map of how control moved through the building, not forcefully, but administratively. Paperwork mattered more than people. Schedules mattered more than truth. That was the weakness. I noticed how often my son's name appeared in files, how financial language slipped into conversations meant to sound medical. Care had an accounting side. Decisions were justified in numbers, not well-being. The longer I observed, the clearer it became that this place wasn't confused about its purpose. By staying still, I was allowed to see. By appearing harmless, I was overlooked. And in that overlooked space, understanding settled in. I now knew how the cage worked, who benefited from it, and why I had been placed inside it. That knowledge changed everything. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, through details that no longer fit the story I had been given. Forms referenced permissions I didn't remember granting. Notes mentioned limitations that had nothing to do with my health. My name appeared next to phrases about oversight, management, authorization. I began connecting it all. My confinement wasn't about rest or safety. It was about access, about control. While I was being assessed and contained, decisions were being shifted quietly out of my hands, accounts monitored, authority reassigned. The more I understood, the colder it felt. I replayed the weeks leading up to this with new clarity. The urgency my son showed around paperwork, the way financial topics slipped into conversations dressed as concern, the timing of everything, so carefully arranged around my grief. None of it was accidental. What hurt most was the precision. This wasn't an emotional mistake made in panic. It was transactional, planned. My vulnerability had been used to move pieces into place, legally and efficiently. I wasn't being protected, I was being positioned. Anger came, but it didn't explode. It settled, solid, useful. I understood now why silence was encouraged, why isolation mattered. Confusion made compliance easier, distance made resistance invisible. In that moment, my goal changed. It wasn't just about leaving anymore. It was about proof, about making sure this couldn't be explained away or buried under concern and polite language. They thought I would stay quiet once I understood. They were wrong. Now that I knew what they were really after, waiting was no longer the plan. I didn't rush. Panic would have undone everything I had learned. I waited for the right morning. One softened by routine and lowered attention. After breakfast, during a shift change, the building relaxed in small, predictable ways. I followed the rules closely that day. I dressed. I smiled. I complied. When permission was granted for a short outing tied to a routine appointment, I moved calmly, as if nothing mattered beyond returning on time. Inside, every sense stayed sharp. Once outside, the air felt unreal. I didn't wander. I went exactly where I needed to go. A phone was borrowed. Names I had memorized were finally used. I spoke only facts, not fear. The response on the other end confirmed what I already knew. My concerns were valid. My situation was not normal. I didn't linger. I returned exactly when expected. Heart steady, expression neutral. No alarms sounded, no questions followed. I was escorted back like someone who belonged there, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer isolated. Someone else now knew where I was, how I had arrived, and why it mattered. Papers would be reviewed, timelines examined, quiet inquiries would begin. That night, I lay awake listening to the building breathe around me. Doors still locked, schedules unchanged. On the surface, nothing was different. Underneath, everything was... The system that trapped me depended on secrecy and assumption. I had broken both without making a sound. Whatever they believed about my silence, it no longer protected them. The first move had been made, and consequences were already moving toward them. I felt no guilt, only clarity, and for the first time since arriving, I understood that patience paired with action could return my life, piece by piece, without asking permission from anyone who thought I belonged there. I didn't announce anything, but the place changed anyway. It started with small things. Staff lingered longer outside rooms. Clipboards appeared more often. Schedules tightened. Flexibility vanished. Eyes checked faces instead of hallways. When my son visited, his confidence was thinner. He spoke faster, listened less. He asked careful questions that circled the same concerns. I stayed calm, grateful, exactly as expected. Inside, I noted every shift. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Names were whispered, then repeated. I watched people measure words around me, as if silence itself might speak. The quiet ally avoided my eyes, not from fear, but caution. Pressure had reached the building. I understood then that someone was asking questions, not loudly, not dramatically, but officially. The kind of questions that require answers instead of reassurances. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like overcorrection. They reviewed rules that had never mattered before. They documented behaviors they once ignored. I became the center of attention without being addressed directly. It was almost elegant how fear rearranged the room. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I kept my mask in place and let them underestimate my awareness one last time. Patience had done its work. Whatever story they planned to tell was starting to collapse under its own weight. I could feel it in the air, tightening, brittle. And as I moved through my days, unnoticed and compliant, I knew the pretending wouldn't last much longer. Soon, I would stop pretending and demand answers finally. I chose the moment carefully, not when voices were raised, not when eyes were watching too closely, but when calm made honesty unavoidable. I felt the decision settle, clean and final. I was done being managed by assumptions. I stood differently, shoulders back, breath steady. I answered questions once, clearly, without drifting or apologizing. I didn't volunteer confusion. I didn't soften the edges. The change was small, but it landed. People leaned in. Pens paused. The room recalibrated. I noticed how quickly tone adjusts when certainty appears. Explanations shortened. Reassurances stopped. The careful smiles thinned. I let silence do the work I had been denied. In that space, my history returned to me. Years of decisions made, problems solved, a life carried forward through loss. I hadn't lost that person. I had protected her. There was no speech, no accusation, just clarity. I acknowledged documents by name. I corrected timelines. I requested records, calmly, the way someone does when she knows they exist. I watched control slip from hands that had relied on my quiet. What surprised me most was the relief. Dropping the act felt like setting down a heavy bag I carried too far. Anger softened into resolve. Fear thinned into focus. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was standing. In that moment, I reclaimed my name and the authority it carried. I saw myself reflected back, not as a patient or problem, but as a person wronged and aware. There would be consequences now. Not dramatic ones, but real ones. Processes would move. Questions would demand answers. And as I met each gaze without flinching, I knew there was no returning to the role they had written for me. Accountability had begun, and I accepted it fully, steady, present, and prepared for what followed next with clear resolve. Justice didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic reversals. It came quietly, through processes that finally did what they were meant to do. Reviews were opened, documents were examined, timelines were verified. People who had spoken in reassuring tones were asked to explain themselves in rooms where reassurance no longer carried weight. Professionals stepped in who had no emotional stake in my obedience. Their questions were precise. Their concern was factual. Authority returned to the proper places, slowly but unmistakably. Restrictions were lifted. Oversight changed hands. Decisions about my life were no longer made without me. I felt relief first, sharp and surprising. Then grief followed close behind. Justice does not erase betrayal. It names it. It confirms that what happened was wrong without softening what it cost. I had to mourn not only the experience, but the relationship that had been altered beyond repair. There was no celebration, only steadiness. My safety was restored. My autonomy was acknowledged. Records were corrected. Boundaries were enforced. The system that had relied on my silence adjusted itself around the truth instead. What justice gave me was dignity. It didn't punish in the way people imagine. It prevented further harm. It made manipulation visible. It ensured that what happened could not quietly repeat itself with someone else. I learned that accountability can be calm and still be complete. It can move forward without cruelty and still leave a mark. Watching it unfold, I understood that justice isn't about winning. It's about being seen accurately and protected accordingly. When the immediate danger passed, there was space to breathe again. Not joy, not yet, but stability, safety. The knowledge that the worst had ended, and that what remained was mine to rebuild at my own pace, with clarity and truth finally on my side as I stepped forward. After everything stopped moving so fast, there was a quiet I didn't recognize at first. Not the heavy silence of fear, but something softer, the kind that arrives after adrenaline leaves the body. I slept more. I woke without bracing myself. Ordinary mornings returned, one small habit at a time. I rebuilt my days carefully. Coffee at the table again, short walks without watching the clock, paperwork handled on my terms. These weren't dramatic victories, just proof that my life belonged to me. Relief came in waves, sometimes followed by sadness I hadn't expected. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days felt strong, others felt hollow. Relationships shifted. Some distances became permanent. I stopped explaining myself to people who wanted the story simplified or softened. I learned that peace doesn't always require understanding from everyone else. It requires honesty with yourself. Grief stayed, but it changed shape. It no longer swallowed everything. It shared space with gratitude, with a steadier sense of who I was and what I could survive. I trusted my instincts again. That mattered more than forgiveness. What surprised me most was the strength that settled in quietly. Not loud confidence, just self-respect. I didn't need closure from others to feel complete. I had lived through something that tried to erase me and came back intact. As life steadied, I began thinking less about what I lost and more about what remained. Not answers to every question, but clarity. And as I looked forward, I felt ready to reflect on what this experience truly taught me and why telling it matters now. What stays with me most isn't the fear or even the betrayal. It's the moment I realized that my voice still belonged to me, even when everything else was taken away. I learned that trust doesn't mean surrender, and love doesn't require silence. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. This experience stripped away a lot of assumptions I carried about family, safety, and aging. It forced me to look honestly at how easily vulnerability can be misused and how important it is to stay connected to your own instincts, even when others insist they know better. Especially then. I didn't come out of this untouched. I came out more aware, more grounded. I know now that resilience isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand firm, to document, to wait, and to speak when it matters most. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, I want you to know you're not imagining it. Your confusion deserves answers, your discomfort deserves respect, and your life deserves your consent. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Sharing it wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. If you've ever faced something similar, or if this stirred a thought you haven't named yet, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever had to reclaim your voice when someone tried to take it away? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.